Okay, I have a weird question.
Yeah,
this is hopefully not too personal. I have had this weird thing of late where I find myself like, are you a cross-legged sitter? Like when you sit in a chair normally?
Not often.
Okay. Like, I don't know whether it's just getting old or whatever, but like, I'm now like much more comfortable. Right. Okay. Fair enough. I am also crossing my legs. Not that anyone can see, but like, it is like weirdly gotten much more comfortable for me as I've gotten older. So I don't know.
Oh yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Like, these hips can't do this anymore, man.
That's true.
These hips don't lie though.
All right, Shakira.
From VinePair's New York City headquarters, I'm Adam Teeter.
And in Seattle, Washington, I'm Zach Jabal.
This is the VinePair podcast. So we're still flying, as a duo.
Right. Joanna notably not flying as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, I don't know, man. How you been?
Pretty good. Pretty good. I'll be, it's going to be, for folks who are not super attuned, it's going to be a summer of partial podcast partnerships or whatever, like a lot of trips coming up for all of us. Well, obviously Joanna's still gone, and then, I got some travel, you got some travel. It's summertime, baby. Like, that's what happens.
I'm excited. I'm ready for my vacation.
Yeah.
You ready for yours? You already kind of had one.
Well, I had one. I got a family reunion coming up, which, not maybe quite the same as you guys gallivanting off to Europe. It's a little less, less glamorous.
Where's this happen again?
Winthrop, Washington. Find that one on a map, folks. You can come stalk me if you care to.
I love it. So what you been reading on the site?
Speaking of gallivanting off to exotic locations, I enjoyed Liz Preventure's piece about what bartenders think are the best international cities for cocktails right now. And I enjoyed it both because, of course, interesting just to see what people think, the various cities that are highlighted, kind of obviously a lot of cities in Asia, maybe unsurprisingly, Hong Kong, Tokyo, Taipei, etc., Bangkok, but also in Europe, Amsterdam, Paris. But what was more interesting to me actually than any of the specifics, although of course the specifics are interesting, is just this yet another bit of recognition and awareness that, the cocktail, and especially the kind of craft or high-end cocktail movement, is really a global thing, and that all of these cities and many more, of course, that weren't named, have multiple very highly regarded, highly decorated cocktail bars. And it just reminds me of how this is such a new thing globally. I mean, in some of these cities, it's very new, and in almost all of them, it's a relatively new phenomenon, especially in the kind of incarnation that we think of now in the sort of cocktail renaissance. Because I remember traveling to Europe in the early 2010s and just being like, I didn't go super out of my way. It was a little harder to try and find, but, I went to some places that people had recommended, and the cocktail bars were fine, but they were not, at least to my eyes at that time, on par with what you would find in New York or Los Angeles or even Seattle in the early 2010s or thereabouts. And I think now it's just undeniable that the playing field has really leveled, and that is a cool thing to see, even if it does kind of create a weird, we've talked about this before with some of those bars, like there's a weird sameness to some of them because they're kind of doing similar things in different places. And I think, I haven't been to many of these bars, but some of them I think bring more of the local ingredients and culture to bear on the cocktails than others. But it is an oddity that you do have this kind of quasi uniformity to the top of the cocktail scene wherever you are in the world.
Yes, very true. It's a really good piece.
How about you?
For me, I really enjoyed Courtney Ison's piece on how the Upper East Side is the last bastion of great craft beer in New York City. I like that piece
not
for
where
a few
I would
reasons.
have expected.
Yeah, so I like that piece for a few reasons. One, because we were talking about this piece before it was assigned in the editorial meeting, and it's something that I and a few other people had noticed, having been up on the Upper East Side recently, that there's just a ton of craft beer bars, and it feels like, you're walking around the Lower East Side and the 20 teens and parts of Brooklyn, et cetera. And that these kinds of bottle shops and devoted, rotating craft line places don't really exist many other places in New York anymore, but they're very ubiquitous in the Upper East Side. So I won't give away why she thinks that is. But it's a really fun piece. And he sort of talks about how so many neighborhoods in New York are not homogenous, right? They have their own things going on. And even when people think maybe like craft beer is not as cool anymore as it used to be downtown, it's still very much like a booming thing uptown. So yeah. Zach, you have our topic for today, huh?
I do. So it's something that I've been thinking about for a while, and it's kind of been coming together from a few different directions. One of them is some events I've attended recently and some wine people I've talked to. Some of it is threads of conversations we've had on the podcast and offline even. And I guess the crux of it is essentially this. Wine for a really long time has sort of relied on tradition as a major selling point, right? You know, certainly with some wineries, there's very overt discussion of it. We've been making wine here for hundreds of years in some cases, you know, generation after generation. And even if it's not a specific winery, the traditions of a place can still be seen as very, very valuable or even just central to the identity. And yet I think the part of it that I wanted to come back to is, or sort of question and discuss with you is this a relevant way to talk about wine to the average drinker these days? And in a sense, does relying heavily on that tradition kind of box wine in, both literally perhaps in terms of, the regulations and rules that exist in lots of parts of Europe, et cetera, that kind of create real constraints on how grapes can be grown, wine can be made, et cetera, but also more broadly, like by kind of relying on tradition as this definitional part of what wine is, of sort of almost as integral to the very product, do you kind of create this idea that if you don't have any idea about the tradition or you don't know it, either you're not doing wine right, or you can't, or you're not kind of understanding what the appeal of wine is if you don't have some connection to that tradition. So obviously that's a big, broad topic. We could go in a lot of different directions, but just wanted to kind of lay that out. And then, I'm sure you have some initial thoughts.
So the basic question is like, does the continued sort of promotion of tradition like even really matter anymore?
Right. And or does it kind of like hamstring wine in a certain way? Because I think it certainly matters to some drinkers. I think it would be silly to say otherwise, but how vital is it, and how central should it be to the story that wine is telling about itself?
I think it works in one way and doesn't work in another way.
Right.
So I think on the side of like just the overall tradition of winemaking, I think for some people that gets lost, especially when it comes to this idea that like there's only one right way to make wine or one traditional way to make wine. I think that for a lot of people, that becomes, and only one right way to drink wine, to taste wine, etc. That becomes very elitist very quickly for people. Right. And so I think that for that side of the tradition, it's very tired and needs to change, right? This idea that like wine, because also that tradition is very short-lived, actually. It's a very small portion of the entire history of wine in which we tasted wine the way we currently taste it, or beverage professionals do, right? That we pair it the way we pair it, et cetera, right? For eons before that, it was consumed because it was safer to drink than water, because it was seen as medicinal, because of all these other reasons that it was consumed. Like people, when we look back at, civilizations before this one that consumed wine, maybe it was sacrificial, religious, etc. It's not because it paired really well with the lamb they were roasting. Right. So in that regard, I think there can be an over-reliance on a tradition that isn't very old.
Right.
And there should be adaptation there. On the other side, I think tradition does somewhat matter if that tradition is still authentic to a specific producer. And what I mean by that is, I think some producers that have continued to maintain control of a specific wine for tens, 20s, hundreds of years, generations, that can be also quite impactful. I think the place you get into an issue here is most consumers are very well aware now that there are a lot of brands out there, whether they are fashion brands, car brands, et cetera, that have a lot of tradition in how long they've been manufactured, but the actual ownership and who's in charge has changed hands. And that changing of hands,
there's not a lot of continuity, even if technically speaking, you can say, this goes back to the 1800s or before or something.
Right. And that changing of hands may have changed quality, may have changed, production practices for better or for worse. And I think in wine, you find that often, especially some of these like really lauded houses where it's like, oh yeah, this, this producer of Bordeaux or Burgundy or whatever is now owned by a luxury conglomerate or, an investment firm or whatever. And then I think that like once you start to scratch at the surface of like the background of who actually owns it, et cetera, the tradition doesn't matter that much anymore.
Right.
And the continued reliance on it in terms of marketing may fall flatter than you intend it to, as opposed to just being like, hey, we still make really nice stuff. And that for even like Levi's, like, do you think that the average American consumer cares that Levi's was worn by gold miners?
They probably don't even know. I would be surprised if they did.
You know what I mean? I think about that all the time, but Levi's still sells that, but like, I don't, that doesn't tell me. And yes, I think that 100% means that the garment was of high quality at the time.
Right.
But like now, is it?
Right. Well, and I think, there's a really interesting point in there that I wanted to get at, which is beyond.
I'm glad
even
I made
just
one interesting point.
You made several, but the one that I wanted to pick up on was like, in addition to this question of how much continuity there is in individual brand or producer or whatever, I think it's also sometimes a thing that wine gets a little too kind of caught up in, is this idea of tradition writ more broadly. And you kind of got at this before, where you're talking about how wine is consumed is very different than it has been historically, that this sort of period of time of wine is a very narrow and sort of idiosyncratic slice of what wine has been in most of human history. And I think that that's important to note too, when you start talking about like how wine is made, how grapes are grown. Almost everywhere in the world, even places that can sort of honestly trace back a lineage of, family ownership over generations, et cetera. What is being done now in those vineyards, in those wineries, is almost assuredly very different in almost every case than what was even being done 2 generations ago, to say nothing if you go back further. And that just has to do with realities of things like, 75 years ago, essentially no one was using stainless steel tanks. Like, they are a very relatively recent post-war innovation and use in the wine world. And so lots of kinds of wine that were not possible to be made, or at least certainly could not be made consistently before that, are now possible. And they define a lot of the wine regions that we think about as being these incredibly traditional regions. I mean, I think about this with the popularity of Sancerre, right? Like, Sancerre has been so shaped by the technological innovations of the 1940s and 50s and beyond. And the wine now is just made very differently in most cases than the way it was before. That doesn't make it worse or better functionally. It's just, it is very different. And so when you appeal to that tradition, I think that there's a way in which that can work, right? Because we do have a certain, around wine, there is a certain idea of like, look, if you're a certain kind of drinker, consumer, et cetera, you are drawn perhaps to some of that storytelling. But I think that that is such a narrow slice of the people who like to drink wine. And as you said, it's a very elitist and very kind of alienating way to talk about something to the average drinker. And I think what makes me sad about that is like, you can do, I think, a little bit of both, right? You can rely on the fact that people are aware that wine has a long, history, that regions and places do have that, without having it be sort of the only thing you can talk about or the only way you talk about the wine. And I think that in doing so, you sometimes distract from one of the most important ways to talk about wine now, in my opinion, which is there's never been more good wine available than there is right now. Like, the overall quality of wine is so high globally that like it is kind of a shame to spend too much time focusing on the way wine was made 50 or 100 years ago, when fundamentally, like, almost across the board, the quality is better now than it ever has been. And that's a thing that you can talk about that doesn't totally denigrate the tradition, but at least brings the attention to what's in the bottle now, what's in people's glasses now, and creates excitement around that in a way that, kind of appealing to some historic lore, I just don't think does it.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think for the majority of consumers, they don't really care. They want to know what experience they're going to have with it now, not why they should care more because of how important the wine was, et cetera, 20, 30, right. 40, 50 years ago. I think unless it is an ultimate luxury product, of which, to be very honest, there's actually not many wines. And like, right. I think I keep thinking back to this comment you made during our VinePair podcast, No Joanna time we've had together,
right.
where we were talking about all of these collectors and these cellars that are full and no one wanting to buy what's in their cellars.
Right.
And that's because, and I think what's interesting is that tends to happen a lot with anything that's collected, where we go through these times where almost anything that has any connection to any, like, okay, so let's take this example with Burgundy, right? So you have obviously DRC, but then right. as there becomes a fur, almost anything that's Grand Cru becomes collectible. And then anything that's connected to those vineyards, right, becomes collectible, and it grows and grows and grows because people want a piece of something that feels right. like it's DRC. And then ultimately there's not a lot of people that want those secondary, et cetera, bottles, and that market kind of dries up. And right. no one cares that it was popular 50, 60, 70 years ago, right? And there's so very few, I think, actual staying power, historically significant vineyards, wineries, wines, just like there are very few historically significant fashion labels that really stand the test of time. Do you know what I mean? Right. That don't go through the ebbs and flows of consumer preference and behavior, what's trendy, what's not trendy. Like there's only really a few I think you could name. And then everything else, even if you tried to argue with me, I could argue back, is drafting off the popularity of those other brands, right? Like in Chablis, I mean, we can play this game now together. I may be completely wrong. People come from me like Chablis, like 2 producers.
Right. I mean, there are others that are trendy now that people are excited about. But again, I think you're right. That part of that is because, your Raveneaus, your Dauvissats are not accessible to most people. Right. And it's
Raveneau and Dauvissat.
Yeah. And you have this whole thing where it's like, well, what else can I get that is going to be roughly comparable? I think even more to the point, though, there are 2 specific things here that are going on also, which is one, wine just has a shelf life, right?
Yeah.
It's one thing if you say, Monet will always be popular, right? I'm going to buy a Monet paint. I mean, not you or me, but like a person with a significant amount of wealth. And I mean, yes, I guess in theory that painting will eventually deteriorate, but in terms of like the scale of multiple human lifespans, that painting will be the same painting in 150 years. But no bottle of wine that anyone has now is going to be worth drinking in even 30 or 40 years, probably, to say nothing of 100. And so there's sort of an upper end of collectability, and we're already hitting that with a lot of these wines that are in people's collections. I mean, again, this is part of the problem, right? A lot of those wines just are not actually pleasurable to drink anymore. And so there are curiosities, they're status symbols, but fundamentally there's only so many ways you can buy that and have it not feel like you're a little bit of a chump if you don't end up drinking it. And eventually you have to try and sell it on to someone else, and that's harder to do. And then the other piece of it is like, even if you take at face value the claim that Domaine Romanée-Conti is the best producer of Burgundy on the planet, and I would say, the citation needed on that one, but even so, I don't think it's fair to say that every single vintage, all of the wine they make is better than any other Burgundy that's made. That's just not true. It can't possibly be true. They don't own all of the best vineyards. They don't have the single best winemaking practices. Like, there are other people making equally good wines, at least at some quantity in some places. But that's super fucking confusing for a marketplace that wants there to be a very rigid and understandable hierarchy to price these things and place value on them. And wine, if you actually look at it as a thing that you consume, just does not conform to that. And so you end up with this weird, kind of mishmash of, as you said, the sort of recognizable brands or labels, but then you try them, you drink them, and it's like, well, wait a second, I'm not having the, angelic choir, eye-opening, revelatory experience that the price point seems to suggest I should. So what's going on here? I'm being, maybe I'm being scammed.
So someone said this to me in the wine industry, and I'm curious to to hear what you think. And they sort of like said this to me, like, don't tell anyone else I feel this way. So I won't name them. But they basically said that as wine ages, there is a point when it, could be at prime drinking window, but who even knows when that is? But like that really, like when a wine is really released, if you were like basically that every wine has a moment of singularity where it is really unique and expressive as to what it is. And then ultimately, as most wines age, and I thought this was really interesting, they all kind of taste the same. That it just tastes like oxidized wine.
Right.
Like at some point, yes, you can, and that all you're doing as a person who romanticizes really old wine, right? Like all the people you see that open wines from the 50s, 60s, 70s and put them on their Instagram, whatever, is looking for whatever that singularity of that wine was, somewhat hidden in the sameness now of that wine. Right. That tastes a lot like a lot of other aged wines. And you're hoping to see something that actually made that wine amazing in the 1960s. And sometimes you'll find it and sometimes you won't.
This is like the reason why Rudy Canino one could counterfeit this stuff because I think they all did kind of taste alike, or at least no one was going to be positioned, even people who drank a lot of old wine, to really truly say, oh, this is definitely wrong. I mean, there were people who had suspicions, but that had more to do with, the amount of these wines he was able to come up, put his hands upon, not because any single one was so clearly, not right, I think. But more to the point, your point, I think, this, again, maybe this is a part of this conversation, right? The idea that that older wine is better or kind of more developed. Again, I think there are with really high quality wines, there is a point in the aging curve where maybe they're at their best. Identifying when that is really tricky. It can certainly vary from wine to wine and even maybe from bottle to bottle, depending on the producer. And past a certain point, I think the wine is really kind of, what you're getting out of it is muted or at least covered up a lot by the fact that as wine ages, it oxidizes, it loses intensity, and it's harder and harder at some point to pick out the things that maybe made the wine distinctive. That's not to say that every wine should be consumed super young, although that is, of course, the destiny of most wine. But I think that it's more that this idea of collecting and adding value as a collector through just aging the wine. Maybe there was a time when that was true. I think we are so far out of that world in a qualitative sense. Financially, maybe it still happens with some wines that, again, this is where the disconnect is sort of felt, right? There was traditionally, there were wines that required extensive cellaring to reach their best, right? They were, high tannin, high acid wines that were made somewhat crudely, and they just needed maturation over, a period of possibly decades to be at their best drinking. That's just not how wine is made these days, with the exception of a few very sort of hidebound producers. Almost no one, even in the regions that are, known for this. And obviously you and I both love Barolo. It's a great example, right? Almost no one is making Barolo that is impenetrable at 5 or 10 years of age anymore. It just doesn't make sense for them. They don't need to. So why would they do that? And even people who are much more interested in traditional methods and traditional, ways of aging and stuff like that are still making wines that are far more drinkable young than they ever used to be. And so this idea that you have to connect, quality wine with old wine, quality wine with tradition, I think is both not even borne out by the facts and is, as I said before, limiting. I want to add one other piece here, and I want your thoughts on this too. Yeah. I think the other area where wine is really suffering from an over-reliance on tradition is drinking occasions. And
100%.
We've talked about this before on the podcast, but a thought occurred to me really recently where, there is this thing that we think about with wine. And I think, you and I are both, I don't say guilty of this, but this appeals to both of us in its own way, of this idea of wine is a part of a really nice meal. It's at the table. And that's great. I love wine that way. You love wine that way. Many people do. Certainly many people listening to us do. But I think that I have in the past somewhat discounted wine that is great in other settings, right? The wine that goes great with your, late night TV show, or that goes great on the patio at 2:00 when you're not really eating anything, or all these other occasions where people could be and should be enjoying wine. And they don't have to be part of a established, formal, fancy meal, or even a meal of any kind. And that wine would do better, I think, to, instead of kind of looking askance at those drinking occasions, to lean into them, to embrace them, to say, great, it's awesome that the world of wine is producing wines that go great with, your Netflix and that go great with your steak. Like, those are both valid expressions for wine, and one isn't inherently better than the other just because one has more tradition behind it.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's 100% accurate. I think that there's a lot of wine that is still very focused on only showing up at at occasions they feel are appropriate, right? So like, everyone in wine is getting very excited probably about the impending fall, because that's like wine's big moment when you have these big family occasions of Thanksgiving, and then you move into, the holidays and toasts and, holiday parties. Like, that's wine's time to shine, as opposed to thinking about like, how can it show up in the summertime? What are those occasions that like aren't necessarily natural, but are still what someone would want? I think there's more of a, because of tradition, feeling that one should stay in their lane, right? Like, this is the thing that this is where we occupy. And you see now a lot of these other places are unwilling to do that. And, they're coming into like the territory of wine because they're bucking that tradition, right? They're saying, well, why can't we, we were told that whiskey was only for after the meal. Why can't we be consumed the entire time? Right. That kind of stuff. So I think that's very true. I also think that like, the one other thing that I've been reflecting on, because of, Keith refusing to always get off his soapbox about this shit, is that I think tradition stands in our way a lot in terms of the way we as American consumers look at the wine made in our own backyard.
Absolutely.
And I think we are very much so tied to this idea that the best wine can only come from these regions in Europe, et cetera, and that everything else is kind of a copy or dupe of those wines, that we're unwilling to accept that great wine could be being produced in the Finger Lakes or Virginia or Maryland or Washington State, right? And like really world-class wines. And I think that does all of us a disservice, because those are the easy access points to then get into wine, right? When there's a winery in your backyard or very close to your backyard producing great wine that you can go visit and have experiences at, that's the easiest way to fall in love with wine. But even in the regions where those wines are made, you'd be hard pressed at a lot of restaurants to see those wines on those restaurants' menus. Right. They still believe that like to have a serious wine program, the wines have to come from 4 to 5 regions in the world. Barolo, right? Like, and that's it. And even when I see like these younger wine influencers, right? It's not just the old, these younger wine influencers on Instagram and like learning about wine or blind tasting wine, et cetera. They're almost always talking about the wines of Europe. All of them, right? So like this is something that is pervasive in the culture of wine, right? Like if you're these two cool young guys and you're blind tasting wine, but your guesses are very often wines from Europe, that just, I think, that's no fault of your own. That's the fault of what has just happened in wine culture, where we think that like if the wine is great and interesting and cool, it must come from Burgundy, the Loire, Piedmont, Tuscany, et cetera. Like we can't fathom that those wines would come from locations in America, Australia, et cetera. And it's a real issue.
And it's worth noting, too, that I think there is a little bit of blame to go around everywhere on that specific point, because I think a lot of producers, certainly in the United States, when these regions, especially newer ones, were getting established, their reference points were Europe, right? They were saying, we want to make wines. If you're someone who got into wine because you love it, you probably got into it because you tried wines you really liked. There's a pretty good chance that those wines were at least in part European wines. And maybe you thought, I can make wines. I want to try and make wines like that here where I am or here where I'm moving to, right? Whether that's, in Virginia or in Washington or Oregon or wherever. Mm-hmm. And a lot of wineries in the US still traffic in that language, right? They still talk. I mean, again, a lot of producers in Oregon still talk about their Burgundian Pinot Noirs and Chardonnays. And, that's something that I find sort of limiting and not very useful in terms of, your own success as a region, as a brand. But it's it's very comfortable and familiar turf for a lot of people to operate on. It's just very limiting. It's unduly deferential to those regions, which look, have historical pedigree, have certainly been very important in the history of wine. I don't think you have to say like, we're going to rewrite the history books. I think you can just say that's cool that stuff mattered and still matters. It's just not the only thing that matters. It's not the only place that matters. It's not the only way to make wine that matters. And even if you are, copying or, sort of grafting on some of those techniques, so what? Like, that's okay. Again, they were not using stainless steel in 100 years ago in those places either. So it's not like the fact that they've been using stuff like that slightly longer means that it's like they have an unlimited, kind of copyright on that or whatever. And so I just feel like, certainly when it comes to this country and the wines of this country and really of the world that's not Europe, I think it's worth thinking about that, like, there are really intentionally grown and made wines, really high quality wines from all over the place. And if your reference point is exclusively Europe, and that's the way you orient your mind, your wine program, your purchasing decisions, et cetera, I think you are just kind of unduly limiting yourself. And I get it. It's driven some by consumers. It's driven by what is already out there. But I think there's real value in, thinking for yourself a little bit on this stuff and trying stuff and just embracing that the world of wine is actually vast and interesting and super vibrant, even despite all the doom and gloom. Yep. And that if you, look around you and taste around you and explore around you, there's really cool stuff kind of all over.
I agree. This was an interesting conversation. Let us know what you think. Yeah. Hit us up at podcast@VinePair.com. Hopefully we'll be joined by Joanna on the Monday episode.
If she can get back from Scotland. Good luck.
I know she's getting delayed. And yeah, I'll talk to you on Monday.
Sounds great.
Thanks so much for listening to the VinePair podcast, the flagship podcast of the VinePair Podcast Network. If you love this podcast, please leave us a rating or review wherever it is that you are currently listening to it on. It really helps other people discover the show. Also, tell your friends, tell your neighbors, tell your colleagues. Basically, tell anyone about the VinePair podcast. It's always very appreciated, especially by Joanna. The podcast is hosted by myself, Adam Teeter, our editor-in-chief, Joanna Sciarrino, and Zach Jabal, former sommelier from Seattle, Washington, as we all know. It is edited by Darby Seaside. Theme music also by Darby Seaside. Art for the podcast by Daniel Grinberg. VinePair was co-founded by myself and Josh Mallon. Thanks so much again for listening, and we will see you again the next time you listen to an episode. If you made it all the way through these credits, I again consider you a super fan.